Yo, this is me, Mike, Ringmaster of the Imagination Circus, and I'm here to do something I've been wanting to do in a while, and have been planning to do for a while. Now, I am a huge fan of RWBY. I've did some reaction videos to Volume 6. I might have done at least one reading of a very particular fan fiction. You can find it somewhere on my channel, I'm sure. But regardless, I'm a huge fan of RWBY, and I've been wanting to make more RWBY videos. Now, this video is one of 3 RWBY videos I've have in the works right now. But frankly, I've been wanting to do more RWBY for a while, and luckily, I bought this. This, of course, is RWBY After the Fall, which is a little novel, like young adult novel, written by one E.C. Myers, with a story by Carrie Shaw Cross and Miles Luna. And as such, I bought this thing in advance a couple of months ago. Back when Volume 6 was still going, and of course I was doing my reactions at the time, I heard about this. I had to get a copy. I was in such a RWBY mood, I had to buy it. And at the time, I was, from the very beginning, planning to do a review of this book when it came out. So I did, and I got it, and I read the whole thing. Now, the way this is going to work, as I do this review, is I'm going to give you my thoughts on the story and how it was written and whatnot, and those little, all that I think is important to the actual writing and, the book itself. Then, alright, well, what are my thoughts overall on this book? Well, I thought it was a brilliant choice to focus on Team Coffee. And I thought that long before I got my hands on the actual book. But, for the longest time, I remember hearing about this. I actually heard about this, I think, I went to New York Comic-Con last year, and I was lucky enough, to, hear about that at the Rooster Teeth animation panel, which was, I believe, at Times Square. It was great. The, Miles and the rest of the RWBY team were there. Of course, Gray, Haddock, and whatnot. It was fantastic. And I really enjoyed hearing about all the other projects they had going on. And, of course, they showed us some stuff. They, of course, premiered a little bit of Genlock early. Which, whatever your thoughts are on that. But regardless, I was really excited to not only hear about they were doing comics and probably going to do more of these in the future, and they're doing this. They did this one. I need more of this. I love RWBY. I gotta have it. So, of course, there was that. But, just talking about the book itself, I do think the story is pretty good. I will say I feel like the stakes weren't as strong as they could be. And let me explain what at the beginning, the first fight, and we even open up early on a fight in this story, and I thought it was a pretty good fight. We're fighting these things called mole crabs, which are these huge crabs that are burrow into the sand in vacuo and are pretty dangerous. But apparently they're also a rare delicacy. That, in my opinion, is very interesting. But for me personally, there wasn't a lot of strong tension in the book. There were moments, genuine moments where the tension was pretty good. But for instance, any of the times that obviously our team of the story here, in this case, Team Coffee, any time they, were actually fighting any Grimm in this story, it really, didn't do it for me. Granted, they only had one major Grimm fight in the story. I mean, technically you could say you had 2, but then you had a small horde, you were fighting different kinds of Grimm, we learned about different kinds of Grimm, and then there was one big Grimm at the end, which was a really nice touch in my opinion, and might be a reference to a couple of things. But I really enjoyed that. But the first fight, the one in the town, I can't remember the name of it. I might put it here. Because I've underlined the names of all the different settlements in this book as well. But, the town, the fight in the town, when they're trying to evacuate all of the nomads, they're very, I didn't feel a lot of tension. I was impressed by Team Coffee's abilities, even though they were all, dealing with some stuff at the moment. As such, but I felt like it was almost a little too easy. However, the fight at the end of the story, specifically there were actually a couple of fights that I did think actually worked. The one against the blind worm at the end, that one really worked for me. I felt like there was some genuine tension. And I'm not gonna lie, I was actually a little bit afraid that dear old Coco wasn't gonna make it. I mean, I know that sounds silly, but she's not a main character. And we've already lost Pyrrha And this is not even a main piece of a RWBY, you know, this is not the main series. It's a spin-off. Sure, it's canon, but there was a chance. They could have killed off a member of Team Coffee if they really, really wanted to, but they didn't. And I appreciate that, but I was genuinely afraid for Coco's life. There was the fight against, Bertolac, I believe his name was. Bertolac and, like, you know, Fox and Edward Caspian, was it? Something like that. Him and Edward and Fox were fighting against Bertolac, and that was a genuinely stressful fight. So was the one with Carmine at the very end. That one also felt, there was definitely some tension there. But I actually think I preferred the Bertolac fight a little bit more, even though the Carmine fight is technically the finale fight. Because, I don't know, something about it, maybe it was because of, like, the guy, I don't know, something about it, it felt, the tension was just a little bit more effective there for me than for that final fight. But the final fight overall was enjoyable. And I was not entertained by the fights as described in this book. I just felt like the tension wasn't always so super effective. But otherwise, I liked it. The story itself definitely worked. I will say I'm not the biggest format of moving from one time period to another. Or at least I'm less a fan of it in written form as I am in the visual works of, say, a TV show or film or animated work. You know what I mean? Because, like, something about doing it in a... I mean, it was good. It didn't happen, like, with the exception of one or two flashbacks, it didn't happen during the individual chapters, but from chapter to chapter, we would work in the present, and then we would maybe get a flashback to the past, and that works just fine. But, like, you know, but it's really not my favorite way of storytelling, but it did work to give us a little bit more of Team Coffee's backstory, and for that, I do appreciate it. What else? So many details, so little time. Otherwise, there were a couple of details I think were not necessary, and I did notice that the stuff specific to the RWBY universe and the world of Remnant, those got brought up. Like, granted, it stopped pretty early on because there were only a few things, but they had very specific descriptions early on for stuff like aura, and semblances, and what else? There was at least one other thing that I'm definitely forgetting. There might have been one for the Grimm, I don't remember. Dust. There was definitely one for Dust. But, and that's interesting to me because it's clear that you wouldn't do that for an actual, like, the people like us, those of us who have actually already been fans of RWBY for a couple of years, you wouldn't need to do that. So I could only assume that they did it specifically because for the people who they think are going to get into it. Specifically, since this is a young adult novel, it's going to, you know, be for those people who, like, got into it, like, you know, who are just getting into the idea, you know, have no other reference point for this series, and are just getting into the series in question. And, you know, the problem with that, at least in my mind, you know, I mean, I appreciate it, but it does kind of take away from the story a little bit. It does derail it just a little bit. But it only happens, like, 2 or 3 times, so it's not terrible, but it is kind of distracting the few times that it does occur. Otherwise, what else? I'm sorry, my memory, I read this, like, 2 days ago, and it's, like, you know, I've only gone over it, like, a little bit since then. So, you know, I've never reviewed a book before, so this is new to me, so bear with me. I should have said that from the beginning, but I will say, yeah, it did come off very much like a YA novel, and it's not let's talk about the writing itself. The writing itself was good. It wasn't great. Like, I wasn't moved by the wording choices, but it was competently written, and it did the job, and I don't think the characters, granted, we haven't spent as much time with Team Coffee as some of us would have liked in the show, but none of the characters seemed out of character to me personally, so I think that worked for what it was. You know, there are certain times where I would have liked to, like I said, maybe if the writing was better, I would have felt that tension I wanted, but otherwise, I think this story worked for what it was, and that was a nice little spin-off telling us what some of our other characters were going through and what their lives were like after the fall of Beacon, and it gave us a little bit more context for some of the other things going on. For instance, what's actually happening at Beacon right now, more or less, in, you know, because we've only seen glimpses of it or heard secondhand accounts. We haven't really gotten a glimpse of that, and that was nice to get from this story. let's talk about essentially the character arcs for the four main characters here. And I like the way they do this. I'm not entirely sure how much of that is like stuff they added to make this story work, or otherwise, but I like to think that this like was something they partially planned for the book itself and partially planned in advance, because knowing, like, I know that, like, obviously, like, Velvet was like a character they used to show like how Faunuses were being treated, and then they expanded her character, and then they came up with Team Coffee. So not all of this was planned from the very beginning, but I like to think a little bit of this stuff has been planned for quite a while. So let's focus on the individual character arc. Let's start off with Fox, because we got a lot about his character here. For one, they finally confirmed he was blind. Like a lot of us, and I wouldn't be entirely surprised if that was something that that wasn't decided upon when they came up with his character design, but everybody kind of, became a fanon idea, and RWBY, the RWBY crew, or the Crewbie, absorbed it and decided to make that canon for him, and I like that. I also like the detail that his ability to sense using aura and sense aura is so good that he uses it to get around, to deal with it. We also got some little stuff, like, I can't remember it off the top of my head, I'll get to it when we get into it, but of course we finally learned that the names of all of Team Coffee's weapons, which I really, really appreciated, because, we haven't gotten some new names for weapons in a while. We don't even know the name of, say, Raven's sword or Ozpin's cane. So I like the fact that we got the actual names of Team Coffee's weapons was a real delight to me. I know it's such a minor detail, but I really appreciate that. But what was I saying? Yeah, about the characters themselves. Well, the focus was definitely on Coco and of course Velvet. Velvet being like a fan favorite and the reason Coffee as a team even exists. But as for, Coco, like, she definitely had a great spotlight as a leader who is apparently somewhat insecure about her position as leader. And that seems to be a common theme in RWBY, about people, specifically team leaders, but people in general, just being leaders and being insecure about that position. And, we've seen this with Jean and RWBY early on. We saw it here with Coco, and I really like that that's a through line for those characters. Makes me wonder what if Cardin had that sort of struggle. I'd like to think he did. I don't hate the guy, but that's not important. What is important is I very much like that that's a focus we get, and we learn a little bit, of course, about Coco as a character. She's gay, apparently, not super important. It's hinted at 2 or 3 times, and then stated more or less, not blatantly. In fact, I'd say they draw just enough attention to it in that case. But my problem is they kind of lay it on thick. Not super thick, but there are certain clues in the book about Coco being gay before we actually find out. And my problem with that is this, is that you're hinting at it throughout, and you don't, maybe hint at it once. Just once is good enough for me. I feel like they overdid it just a bit with emphasizing that she was gay. You don't want to like Flanderize it. You don't want to overdo it. Just draw the most minute amount of attention. Make sure everybody knows that it's there, and then be done with it. And you know what? That was mostly what they did, but I do feel like they overdid the hints just a bit. But then again, I don't know what this book's age range was intended for, but then again, it was written, I have to assume it was, because it was clearly written with us as fans of RWBY in mind. So you have to assume, I don't know, maybe I'm thinking too much about it, and that's my problem. But I feel like they overemphasized enough. But still, it's good to get another, LGBTQ character, in there. And it's good to have that confirmed. Whether or not we'll actually see that once we see Team Coffee again in the show, well, we'll see. What else? Let's focus on Velvet. Velvet's, storyline, was almost in contrast, very much about how she just did not want to be in Vacuo. She didn't want to be at Shade. She didn't want to go there in the first place, and she just didn't like it. And that's a big part of her character arc in this book. It seems to be about her, asserting herself as a competent member of Team Coffee, and about, expressing that part of her that she really hates being here in Vacuo, and so she wants to get out. And I like that that's the storyline they went with her. And there's even a contrast between her and like Coco. Early on in the prologue, which seems to be mostly from Velvet's point of view, we have her like talking about how you have to be careful and how like if how it's an opinion of Vacuans that if you can't handle the local spice, which is just sand, then you probably don't deserve to be here. But at the beginning of Coco's first chapter, which is, I believe, chapter number 1, if I'm remembering correctly, she talks about how she's gotten used to the sand. And so that's even just that's actually kind of a subtle little difference between these two characters. And I very much like that. But we'll get into some of the other character stuff with them as I talk about the stuff I've underlined in the book. Then, of course, there's Yatsuhashi. Yatsuhashi probably has, like, the weakest character stuff in the book, but what's there is super effective for what it is. So we get a flashback learning about him learning his semblance and his backstory, and I really like the backstory for him. I like that he's this kind of gentle giant that is powerful and tough, but because of his size, people are afraid of him, and so he has to like be very careful, and that's why he doesn't talk much. So I really appreciate that as a detail, and what we get from his backstory, which I will talk about because that's important, but like I guess I'll talk about it now. His backstory is, in my opinion, very effective because we learn about his semblance, and his semblance is to take away memories from other people. And that is interesting for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that it's not a semblance that's of any use against the Grimm. Majority of the semblances can be used in battle against Grimm, but this semblance is very much something that could only be used effectively against other people. And while that's good, because if you are fighting someone, and hopefully it'll come in handy later down the line, but it can be dangerous, and he's very apprehensive about using it, and I like that because it's a good part of his character, and it explains why he can be such a quiet character. Granted, part of that in the show is just that they never we've heard him talk once, and but I like that they came up with a reason, and I think it really works. The fact that like the big reason he's so apprehensive about it is that he accidentally used it on his mother once because he just wanted to go out and play, and because of it, he made her forget his little sister, his infant sister, who had only been born a little while ago. And he didn't like that she was getting all the attention, but he wasn't actively trying to make his mother forget her. It just kind of happened. And that one genuinely unnerved me. When we got that flashback in the book, that one genuinely set my nerves on edge, made me very scared. My hairs were standing on end, all that. It genuinely got to me. It might have even been the most effective part of the writing emotionally, and that's impressive because it hit me in the worst way possible. It was like something out of a horror movie even, or an episode of The Twilight Zone. Just, it really set my spine a-tingling. So I really appreciate that, and the reason it's important is because it has, like, his character arc is very much him trying to help out this kid, August, whose name, I like that his nickname is Gus, because that's clever, because you don't often see characters' nicknames that are like, where they take the part of the thing you call them out of the middle of the name, but that's a minor detail, but I like that. But we get August as a character, and I like him because he's got this thing where he secretly has this dangerous quirk that he can amplify other people's emotions. And because of that, it brings out the hidden, secret, dangerous emotions that can draw in the Grimm. And because of that, he's like very dangerous. And if anything, his semblance is way more dangerous than Yatsuhashi's. But it's effective because it gives Yatsu a role in trying to help this kid out throughout the story and try and get him comfortable. Granted, he doesn't learn until very later in the line, but even early on, before they even know, he's helping to comfort him because he's got this, quirk that can cancel other people's quirks, or that's what he's telling them, but really it's his grandfather's quirk. But even then, it's effective because you could feel this connection growing through him, and he even gives him a little bit of advice in the end of the story, and I really appreciate that. So his is probably the weakest of the character arcs, but for what is there, I think it really works. Then there's Fox, and I want to talk about Fox last just because we got a lot for him because he is a character we really haven't heard talking. For a while there, I thought he was death. Not death. Everybody thought he was blind, and it turned out to be true, but I thought he was actually mute, and it was cool to see that he wasn't mute. He just doesn't like talking very much, but it makes sense he doesn't talk so much because he only wants to talk comfortably around people he knows and likes. But beyond that, it's because he has a semblance that allows him to telepathically communicate with his teammates and others, of course, but especially his teammates, and it's very effective. And I'm actually kind of amazed. I had never considered whether telepathy as a possible semblance, and I kind of I feel like a dum-dum for not thinking of that, but that's actually a really cool idea, and I like it, and it works, that and the memory, and they all have, and of course we've known but since I'm talking about that, but I'll finish talking about Fox first. But outside of that, he's also from Vacuo. And it's very interesting when we consider him and Sun as characters, because learning about Fox's character being from Vacuo, and then learning about Sun, who's also from Vacuo, both of them got out of Vacuo and went somewhere else. Sun went to Haven. He's back at, I'll talk about that as well, but he's back at, He's going back to Shade. He's bringing his team with him. And then we've got Fox, who also left, but he went to Beacon. So it's interesting. We've got two people who are determined to be huntsmen, but both of them are from Vacuo and decided to leave. And if that doesn't show, it's very interesting to consider, because the people who can live in Vacuo are very impressive. And hell, Fox and Sun, as people who grew up there, are definitely very impressive. But the part that really strikes me is the fact that as characters, they decided to leave this place. So they got how harsh Vacuo was, and they decided they want to make sure that other people didn't have to live that way, or at least that's Fox's reasoning for leave. We don't know about Sun yet, but Fox wanted to make sure that others didn't have to suffer quite as badly as he did, and make sure that they didn't have to suffer pointless deaths after what happened to his parents, because his parents weren't murdered, they weren't mauled by Grimm, they got taken in a freaking sand pit in the desert, out of nowhere, meaningless, no intent from it, just death. Pointless death. And if you could ever call death pointless, then that's probably the closest thing to it. But it's just sad, really, and I like that that's his motivation, because it's very unique, especially in RWBY and even other stories, to want to become a huntsman, or to become someone who protects others just for the sake of making sure no one has a pointless death, is very unique, and I really like that, and I really like Fox's character. Turns out he's actually a pretty funny, sassy guy. I would not have pegged him as such, but he's actually a really funny guy. And that conversation, if you've heard about this book in advance, like I did, and you heard about Miles Luna talking about there's one conversation between RWBY and Fox in this book, I gotta tell you, it is a pretty funny conversation. The end of it was the part that I found the funniest, but it actually is really funny. It's pretty good. So, yeah, these are pretty, if anything, I think the character arcs in the story, from Coco getting comfortable with herself as leader again and coming to deal with certain things, I'll talk about that as well before I finish up, but that's super effective. I liked Fox and learning about his character. Yatsu's was the weakest, but I still like what we got from him, and that flashback for his backstory, genuinely chilling. As for Velvet, we got a lot out of Velvet. It makes sense. She's one of the more popular characters, so the fact that we got so much out of her makes a lot of sense. But I enjoyed that. Let's see, what else I got to talk about? I will briefly talk about, of course, a specific bit from the book when it concerns Coco, and really the whole team, but very much Coco, I think, was the most affected more than anybody else. But before I do, I want to talk about the other semblances. So, like I said, Yatsu can take away memories, and Fox can apparently, communicate telepathically with people. As for, of course, Velvet, we've known about her semblance for quite a while. But Coco's semblance seems to be that she can simply enhance weaponry, or at least the bullets of her Gatling gun. It didn't go into super high detail, so I'm not 100%... I was actually a little bit confused about that, so I'm not 100% sure about Coco, but I have to assume it's simply an enhancement of her weapons. Kind of like, if you're familiar with One Piece, there's this thing called hockey, and it comes in, you could say, 3 flavors. And one of those flavors, essentially, is the ability to, enhance weaponry and to make this kind of hard, invisible armor to the point, and if you can do vulcanization, it'll turn this shiny black, and it's really dangerous, and it'll make things super effective. Now, the interesting thing is, we've already been informed that weaponry and stuff and other equipment in Remnant is all conduits for aura. So the fact that Coco's, like, her semblance seems to simply to enhance her bullets and her weaponry, I don't know, that seems a little too simple to me, but it's probably a little bit more complicated than it sounds as described in the book. But I just wanted to get that out of the way first because I felt like it was kind of, not super important, but a little bit important. Outside of that, I do want to talk about just one bit about Coco's character. Outside of the fact, interesting little character detail, she's claustrophobic, and we get a reason for that. Like so many others, she had a traumatizing experience as a child. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the mission that Team Coffee comes back from in Volume 2, because we actually get some details for it, and, we got a kind of impression from Velvet, because she was the one who replied about it when we finally got to that point in Volume 2, but we never really got any detail about it until this book. And in it, we learn about the mission they were on that prevented them from planning the Beacon Ball, and in it, we also got some stuff before that, but specifically during, and so they go to this town, and it's like, it's kind of one of their, I don't know if it's their first solo mission, but they are solo. It's just Team Coffee, no supervision whatsoever. So they go to this town, and lo and behold, when they get there, they are horrified to find that it's just covered in Grim. Just a horde of Grim. The biggest amount probably any of them have ever seen in a single place. And the town is completely demolished. And from the impression we get, it's just all kind of been stomped and destroyed. And it's a very effective imagery. Like, one of the super most effective parts when it comes to the imagery of this book is the description of how desolate the town is. And the mission is effective as a character point for these characters, and I'll get to why in a bit, but it's very interesting. So we get through the mission, and they've been on for days looking for the survivors of this unfortunate massacre by the Grim. It's so terrible, and they can't find anybody, and they're following Fox because his ability, his aura abilities, and his semblance, more or less, allow him to sense individuals, and so he's slowly getting an impression, and they're slowly going, and they're getting there, and they're worried, and they're getting irritable. They've not getting as much sleep as they should. They're running out of food and water, and they can't find any survivors. And so it gets heated to the point that Team Coffee has a terrible argument. The kind of argument you watch these characters, or in this case, read them, and you feel everything they're feeling because it is described very effectively in the book. You get this impression that they are just like, they are done, and they've never had an argument like this, and they are upset, and a couple characters are insulting each other for a number of reasons. Coco especially is super irritable, and is not it's kind of showing her worst qualities. But as they finishing up this argument, they finally locate the survivors, and lo and behold, it's not much. A whole town wiped out, and who survives? A single family. A father, a mother, 3 daughters, and a single son. That is it. That is the entire surviving population of this town. All wiped out. And that is horrifying enough. It adds on to the stress and the absolute peril they're feeling. And it's no wonder what happens. By the end, they end up encountering another huge Deathstalker. And then, when they finally do get out of the cave, what happens? They can't save them. They are this close, but the family gets trapped in the cave entrance, and they are crushed to death. And I gotta tell you, that was very effective, because I didn't think that they would do it. I did not think this story would have the balls to kill off a family of civilians so easily. And I've always said this about a written form of media, whether it's a novel or comics even, more than visual, more than like a movie or a TV show or some animated series. They are willing to go to places that you don't necessarily hear about in television. And so to have this happen, I'm not sure they could do this on RWBY, on the actual show. Maybe they could. Maybe, I mean, they certainly have a better chance of doing it being like a web series and being made by Rooster Teeth, but I'm not 100% sure they could do something like this. So having it happen here in the book caught me by surprise, and it was very effective on an emotional level, because while I'm sad that this family has died, the part that really is getting to me is because it affects our characters, it affects Team Coffee, and that is the part that gets to me, and it just really kind of got to me. That is no other way to put it. It really is just sad. And so they go back. But before they do, of course, out of nowhere, Professor Port comes in and saves them, which, good on you, Port. I appreciate that. But more importantly, what happens is Coco wants to stay behind to try and take down, I forgot to mention this, the Goliath that showed up outside of the cave, because they basically taken care of the Death Star, or more or less, but this Goliath shows up, and it's implied that the Goliath is what stomped through the town and totally destroyed it. But it is a simple, effective point in the story. And it's because we feel their pain. To the point, we feel it because we can read it, because we get the impression from it that Coco is just devastated by this loss, by this failure. And to the point where she wants to stay behind, even though she is no chance against this Goliath. And Yatuhachi has to drag her back, and they go back, and it's simple and it's effective. Especially afterwards. We get a brief glimpse from the point of view. That scene we saw of them coming back from this very mission in Volume 2. We see that from the rest of Team, more or less, the rest of Team Coffee's point of view, and specifically Velvet's point of view, and we feel their pain, and the pain you're hiding. And you got an impression that things were bad from what Velvet said when, Team RWBY asked her in Volume 2. She said, oh, nothing happened. There were just so many, and you get the impression that something happened, but it's not something that I think anybody in the series has ever really focused on too heavily. And so to have it expanded upon so effectively here, it's probably one of the highlights of this book, because it is one of the more effective parts on an emotional level. And so I really appreciate that. But afterwards, we get this great scene because, Velvet is taken by Good Witch, to finally get a little bit of her. It's been a while, but we get a bit from her, and we get to see a conversation made between, basically, almost, not, I wouldn't say interrogation, but for lack of a better word, interrogation, between Ozpin and Glinda and Velvet, and she's by herself because her team, they're not really feeling like togetherness, even though the three of them stuck together, but it was kind of incidental, really. And so the three of them are together, and they're all feeling their failure hard, and they all feel somewhat responsible. They all feel guilty, especially Coco, but Velvet is probably a close second. And by the end of it, what happens is they find out that, we get a brief, rest in peace, Pyrrha, we get to see her one more time, and of course Team Juniper along with Neptune and Sun, and apparently so they tell Sun and Neptune tell them that we saw Velvet get taken up to the tower, and they assume that she's getting reprimanded, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. Sure, they failed, and they do get punished for it, even though you can't necessarily, it's their fault, but it's also not their fault. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But they go up there and they confront Ozpin in a very effective way. And I love the bit where, where Glinda lifts up Yatsu so easily with her telekinesis, and he's been lifted up to the ceiling of Ozpin's office. It's a very effective moment, showing off her power and kind of the, bullheaded, no, it's like not pig-headed, bullheadedness of Team Coffee here coming to Velvet's defense. The speech Ozpin gives is very effective because it emphasizes that, what they did, they're all feeling guilty, and but they should learn from this experience, because it's unfortunately probably going to happen again. And beyond that, as a factor, they need to be able to, really work as a team, because them coming in at this last second to confront Ozpin on Velvet's behalf is the first time, at least according to him, that they've effectively been a team. And since we haven't really seen Team Coffee up to this point, we kind of we have no reason to think otherwise. And it works very well. They've been a team, but they haven't been a team. And this is the first real moment. They finally, and they do have a conversation afterwards. They solidify some things. But it's mentioned throughout, long before we get this flashback, that Coco is not feeling effective, and she hasn't felt effective since the failure during this mission. And it's good to see why that is, because yeah, I could kind of see it. I did not take it as seriously until I read it, and it's very effective, and it's very tragic, and it's a lot more intense than I ever would have expected. So yeah, so while there are a couple of minor things I griped about, I've mostly been praising this book because I do think when it does stuff well, it does stuff really well. So if you haven't already bought a copy, please do. Please give back to the team at, Rooster Teeth, and at, Rooster Teeth in general, but the RWBY specifically. And please buy and when it comes time, give them some props. Because, I know that, RWBY, a couple of us haven't been totally satisfied. Volume 4 was fun, but it wasn't the best. And Volume 5 had problems. I still liked it, but it did have a lot of problems, I will admit. Some minor, some not so minor, but regardless, I think Volume 6 was more than effective, and it surpassed my expectations. So if you still love RWBY like I do, please go out and purchase a copy of this book wherever you can. Amazon, your local bookstore, I'm sure it's listed there. Or, of course, the Rooster Teeth store itself. But please, buy a copy. It's pretty good, all things considered. But let's get... Alright, yeah, that was my review. So, let's get to the sign-off, shall we? Yeah, before we get to that, let me give you my, my normal greeting. This is Mike, or rather my normal greeting. My normal farewell, as it were. So this is Mike, Ringmaster of the Imagination Circus, and if you feel so inclined, please do come and visit me again in the future. I thank you, and have a good day. Pretty much on the very first page of the prologue here, in the middle, we get this thing about what is the biggest, the most popular item in the tourist gift shops were a t-shirt that read, quote, Vacuo. The wrong place at the wrong time and a terrible place to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there. First of all, nice play on a tired trope. I very much like that. Second of all, let's be honest, we all know this is going to end up being some Rooster Teeth merch. Am I right or am I right? So the way I figure it, now the simple question about it is it going to be merch that, they're not going to release it for a while, at least until we actually get to Vacuo? One will actually be able to see what it looks like in the show? Or, with the release of this book, will this be coming out as a piece of merch very soon? Because only people such as myself and others, like you, who might have been reading this, or maybe you don't care that you haven't read the book yet and you've decided to just watch my review in that case, thank you very much. I appreciate that. But, if that is the case, it's going to be only the people who've read this or at least heard about it who are going to want to buy it, because they're not going to have any context for it. But, so my money is it's not going to come out as a piece of merchandise until we hit Vacuo, but I could totally be wrong.